Throughout the 60s and 70s, Pontiac and Chevy went head to head. They might be cousins from GM, but they attracted completely different buyers. Now, that being said, both manufacturers produced a 400 cubic inch engine. Now, this was achieved with a 4.12 by 3.75 inch stroke on both engines, which means that they should perform really similarly. Now, we're using 1976 numbers here. These are smog era numbers, which means you're probably going to find these engines on Marketplace, eBay, or just down the road for me for sale. So the 1976 Chevelle was rated at 175 horsepower at 3,600 RPM and 305 pounds of torque at 2,000 RPM. The Pontiac Trans Am, for instance, was rated at 185 horsepower at 3,600 RPM, same RPM, and 310 pounds of torque at 1,600 RPM. Now, a little lower RPM there. Typically, that's due to Pontiac having less runner volume, longer runners, and just trying to get that port velocity up. Now, this obviously changes pretty heavily once you start modifying the engine. Typically, you're going to run into more compression and bigger intake runners when you start swapping heads. So, what does that mean for you? First, let's take a look at the Pontiac. Most guys with Pontiac will run Edelbrock heads, an R.P.M air gap dual plane intake, 1 78 inch headers with 38 inch primaries, and a Crane HR 242 cam. This is a 242-252 at 114 degree LSA, 0.558 lift on intake and exhaust, and it performs very, very well in this engine. Now, we're looking at 502 horsepower at 6,000 RPM and 499 pounds of torque at 4,500 RPM. That's a pretty respectable engine, and it's kind of an expensive build for what it is, but it's going to be an extremely fun engine when you get down to it. Now, let's compare that to the Chevrolet Small Block 400. So on the Small Block 400, we're going to run Flowtech 220cc heads. These are actually under about $1,000 for a pair, assembled. 1 7 inches headers, another Edelbrock R.P.M air gap intake, and the HR 240 cam that's available in the small block. Now, the HR 240 is a little bit smaller cam than we find in the Pontiac, but that being said, it does have a little higher lift. So we're sitting at 240, 248, 114 degree LSA, and 0.595 intake and exhaust lift, meaning it's got a little more exhaust lift, but a little less duration than that of the Pontiac. So it should perform fairly similarly, if not give you a little bit more low-end power. So let's go ahead and compare these two on the dyno sheet. But before we do that, let's take a note of 502 horsepower at 6,000 RPM and 491 pounds of torque at 4,500 RPM. So it's really, really close to that Pontiac. That being said, if we go ahead and overlap these two, it is pretty much exactly overlapped other than at the very peak. Now, the big difference here is going to be the average horsepower in the range. We're sitting at 2,000 to 6,500 RPM, even though you're going to shift this at probably about 6,200 RPM. So we're sitting at 356 average horsepower and 430 average pounds of torque throughout that range. Now on the Pontiac, it's sitting at 360 average horsepower in that range and 437 foot-pounds of torque average throughout that range. Meaning the Pontiac has a very slight advantage, and it might beat out that Chevrolet a few times, but it's going to come down to the driver, conditions, loss through the transmission, rear end gears. All of the other stuff is going to matter more than the engines themselves going head to head, as they are essentially the same power band, the same torque, the same horsepower. Now, what this means for you is if you're a small block guy, the 400 is basically the engine that will compete with the Pontiacs. Also, the 400 small block is less weight than the 400 of the Pontiac, because we all know the 400 Pontiac is the same block dimensions as the 326, the 350, the 400, the 428, and the 455. Meanwhile, the 400 small block is the biggest one available of the small block from factory, unless you bore and stroke and all that good stuff. But you can do that in the Pontiac as well. So in my mind, the small block 400 has a distinct advantage over the Pontiac 400. Now, that's not only because of weight, but also because of price to set the stuff up. Edelbrock heads aren't cheap, right? So you can usually build this 400 small block for about the same price you're going to pay for heads on the Pontiac. So it's really up to you guys what you guys think. Comment down below. Let me know what you guys think, what engine you would run in your car and why. But I hope to see you guys Wednesday at 9 p.m. East for a few discussions about Pontiac and small block engines.